Council, this is the second planned workshop for the 2025-2026 biennial budget. This will be followed up obviously by your regular council meeting, and the first reading for that budget ordinance also appears on this agenda. So the intent is for me to provide this presentation, and then I won't then be giving one this evening at the council meeting. So I did just want to point out, obviously we're in a different setting here. We made some investments over the last year just to try to improve this area for the workshops. So, certainly let us know if this is your preference moving forward, but we're just going to use this opportunity to kind of test run this particular room for a workshop. So, and then along those lines, I know Sterling mentioned it, but we do have, because we're using the council chambers, 6:15 p.m. kind of hard stop. So maybe we can finish earlier than that like we did last time, but the goal would be a 6:15 p.m. hard stop. And before I jump in, I do just want to point out and thank Christine Bazem and Russ Swanson. They have been tremendous help this year with our biennial budget process. They're our financial analysts in the finance department, and just wanted to give a shout out to them and a thank you. So I will. So we will get rolling. You can see the agenda here. I've had it up for the last few minutes. So we're going to start with budget comparisons. So your biennial budget comparison, first when looking at the original 2023-2024 budget, that totaled $96.9 million. We then came back as part of our kind of a regular biennial budget process. We do that second year adjustment. And so then that's going to change what that original biennial budget was. In this case, it increased to $100.1 million based on adjustments to the 2024 budget. And then you've got a proposed 2025-2026 biennial budget totaling $116 million. That's an increase of 16% from the updated 2023-2024 budget. So that's kind of broad, high level, 2-year look. Dialing in then on just the annual look. So this evening, the first reading, and then at the next council meeting, your second reading and adoption of the budget ordinance would just be for fiscal year 2025. So as you know, we prepare a 2-year budget, but we do still ask for approval to appropriate and levy taxes on an annual basis. So in this case, your 2025 proposed budget totals almost $62.2 million, which is an increase of a little over $9 million compared to 2024, or a 17% increase. And you can see the largest contributors to that change are going to be your special revenue funds, capital project funds, and your enterprise funds, which are your utilities. So then I'm going to get into fund highlights and point out some of the specific things contributing to the changes in those fund categories that I just mentioned. So to begin, there are some across the board changes that just apply citywide, all funds. For the wages portion of personnel costs, those are $590,000 higher than 2024 in 2025 proposed. That is excluding new positions, which I'll talk a little bit about. The health insurance increase is $222,000 higher. Now recall, and you'll see an item on your council agenda this evening that because of adjustments we made to how much of the health insurance the city would be covering, it was 87.5% in the past. And now the city's going to drop its share of that cost to 85%. So even though our health insurance renewal came in at 12%, we were able to get that net effect down to about 7.5% by the city covering a little bit less and asking employees to cover a little bit more. We have that internal health insurance committee comprised of employees that meet, and it was important to them to keep the insurance, even if that meant paying a little bit more toward the premium. Workers' comp, general liability, and property insurance is actually $156,000 lower in 2025 compared to 2024. This is due to the fact that we changed insurance providers from Travelers to CIVMIC. And if you recall, there was a memo at least a year ago, if not slightly more, where we did project cost savings from making that change. And so that's bearing out in this proposed budget. Getting into the general fund, in 2025 and 2026, I'll try to summarize this where it's a little bit duplicative, but in 25 and 26, we're budgeting $300,000 each year for Emerald Ash Borer. When we came to you at the last workshop, it was $250,000. You had asked us to increase that, and we were able to do so without any net impact to the tax levy. We essentially, and I'll get into the specifics of it when I talk about the environmental fee fund, but we were able to find some non-levy sources of funding to increase Emerald Ash Borer budget to $300,000 per year each year. Conservation and Parks Manager, this is another item. I kind of keep teasing other items on your council agenda this evening, but this is another one you'll be hearing from Amy Peterson about. We did go ahead and budget for a new division within community development, and there's a manager position that's part of that, and the general fund portion of the position would be $30,800. There is a coordinator position. We do expect, if that's something we move forward with, to be funded with grant dollars. And that's kind of part of our financial strategy to kind of ease in the financial impact of this new division. So you just see a general fund impact for the manager position in 25 for the general fund. In 2026, there is a police officer position that's 100% general fund costs. That's $120,400. That would be wages plus benefits. And then Conservation and Parks Coordinator, which would be the third of the three positions. So there's the manager coordinator that's being grant funded, and then a second coordinator position that's $21,100 for the general fund. The ARPA fund, we're planning on exhausting the last of our money in 25. So we're ahead of schedule in terms of meeting the federal deadline for spending that money. And the last thing we plan on doing with it is a police department roof replacement, or kind of a major repair. The specific scope is something we'll be determining soon, but that's budgeted at $435,000. Housing Reserve Fund, we've budgeted $200,000 per year each year for low to moderate income housing loans if needed. So the budget's there. There's no specific plans at this point to issue loans, but we wanted the budget in place should the need arise. We do also in 2026 have the one-time transfer coming into the fund from the TID 5 closure with the affordable housing extension for TID 5. We anticipate that would be $387,000. That essentially will just go to reserves for the Housing Reserve Fund to be used to capitalize future loans for low to moderate income housing. And so that's what you see in the Housing Reserve Fund. For the Environmental Fee Fund, as I mentioned, we wanted to defray some of the levy impact for Emerald Ash Borer, and last year we set the fee for the Environmental Fee Fund to $0. So we're not collecting any money for that. There was a fairly significant surplus in that fund, and one way that we plan on drawing that down in each year is to essentially transfer money to the general fund, where we would then expend money for Emerald Ash Borer. So we did budget 2 transfers out of the Environmental Fee Fund. So there is still a little bit of a levy impact there to get to the $300,000 budgeted each year, but we were able to increase that number by increasing the transfer from this Environmental Fee Fund. And we felt that was consistent with direction that council provided us a year ago regarding this particular fund. For TID 19, it's debt service and financing costs related to Man Valley. So in 2025, it's $986,838. And then in 2026, that's not a typo. It is $986,338. And so when you compare, this is a fund that contributes pretty significantly to the increase in special revenue funds when you compare 24 to 25, because in this biennial budget cycle, we'll have both years of debt service for that TID. We didn't have the debt issued yet to have the debt service payments in 2023. So you see about $1 million more cumulatively in this biennial budget cycle compared to the one we're coming out of. For the library impact fee, we did budget a one-time transfer to the general capital fund of $127,500, almost $600. Our intent here is, in addition to the grant that the city is receiving for the library of $4 million, we were leveraging some additional funds here for the project. So the thought was library impact fees for the portion of that project which would be considered under state statute to be facilitating growth that's occurred in the community over the last several years. But library impact fee funding would be an eligible use for that. And when you collect impact fee funds under state law, you only have so long to spend it. I believe it's 8 years. So once you collect the money, you obviously want to find quality strategic uses for that funding. within the statutory timeline. So we thought this money and this project would be an appropriate match. So for the general capital fund, again, this is another category of funds that are significant contributors to the increase you see from 24 to 25. And the largest contributor to that is the fire station project. So we had previously budgeted it's a $10 million project. We'd previously budgeted $500,000 for design, which is underway. And so the balance then of $9.5 million is being budgeted in 2025 in the general capital fund. In 2026, there's $1 million budgeted for the Kinney Corridor, which is phase 1, where we would have assistance from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And then in the out years, so just in 6 months or so, we'll be talking about those out years. You'll see some additional budgets out there for ongoing phases of that project. Just to keep going, getting close to the end of the fund highlights though. For the electric utility, we did budget $11 million for purchased power in 2025, which increases to 11.2 in 2026. I would say, as a general rule of thumb, as you're aware, we talk about this during the fiscal plan, certainly applies to all of our funds. We try to budget conservatively. So, it was $10 million in 2024. We're going to be in that ballpark for our actual expenses. So it's possible this may end up being high, but obviously as a matter of budgeting conservatively, we'd rather be on the high end than the opposite. So, and then working capital contribution of almost $2.4 million in 25 and $1.5 million in 2026. As we talked about at the last workshop, this particular fund is below the working capital policy that council set for 90 days. So part of the rate increases for this utility, which is included in the budget, helps us bring that working capital back up to council policy, and it helps us prepare for ongoing capital costs in this fund, which we would otherwise have to borrow for because there isn't sufficient cash. You then incur interest costs, et cetera, et cetera. So the rate increase and kind of the implications of that are being budgeted for in the electric utility to put us on a more fiscally sustainable trajectory. With the water utility, it's the same story. So working capital increases by $856,000 in 25 and almost $670,000 in 26. I did just want to point out for this particular fund that we do have a water bond anticipation note currently out there that we issued last year. That is interest only in this particular biennial budget. It does come with a balloon payment in 2028. So, and that's a $4.9 million balloon. Our intent there would be to refinance at that time based on development that occurs in Man Valley. So what you would end up potentially doing then is refinancing as TID debt, or you could refinance as water utility debt. Certainly our intent would be to hopefully refinance that as TID debt at that point. But the water utility is currently paying those interest-only costs right now while we wait for development to occur in the TID. Sewer utility, really the big story there is the debt service. So with our 2023 issuance for the biosolids project, we now have debt service totaling $1.2 million in 25, almost $1.2 million again in 26. Now, when we borrowed last year, we structured that borrowing so that it's slightly backloaded. So the first 2 years of debt service are about $350,000 per year. The third year, which would be 2026, is about $500,000. That coincides with the 2025 payoff of our 2005 Clean Water Fund loan. And it also coincides with our operating and maintenance costs for the Ellsworth Biosolids facility coming offline, since we're leaving that consortium to do our own biosolids facility. So those two things coming off the books coincide with how we kind of stepped up the debt service from last year, so that the net effect from a debt service perspective should be fairly flat. But overall, our borrowing is higher because of last year's borrowing. So those are kind of the two biggest impacts in the sewer utility budget. Otherwise, you would see a decrease for operating and maintenance costs in 26 related to us leaving the consortium. And overall, it's about a $300,000 to $400,000 per year savings from us leaving. And that's something we'll be tracking over time to report back to you all about. And then for the library, really the big story here is the library facility project. Now, that just got announced, so it did not make it into the budget, but To be determined in 2025 or 2026, we'll obviously be constructing a project that ranges anywhere from $4 million to $7 million. It's at least 4. That was our grant award. As you saw earlier, we have some library impact fee money going toward that project as well, and then any other fundraising, capital contributions, anything like that we might get along the way. So we're still fleshing out the scope and the specifics of that project, but that's something I wanted to point out as well. You'll be seeing those expenses over the next 2 years. So that was it for fund highlights. So one of the things I also want to point out is an adjustment to how we're budgeting starting in 2025 and moving forward is how we allocate positions across funds. So in the past, historically, we would budget the positions you see here 100% to the general fund and then charge those back to other funds in the form of a transfer. Moving forward, just to try to clean it up a little bit, make it a little bit easier to administer, we're just going to charge these positions directly to the funds that receive services from them. So you'll see the impact of that throughout the budget, where the general fund is actually going to be spending less on personnel costs, less on personnel costs. The other funds would spend more, but the general fund also has a corresponding decrease in transfers. So the net effect is really the same. It's more of an exercise in adjusting how we account for it a little bit to better charge and make administration of this process simpler. So you can see positions there and the non-general fund services that are supported by them that get charged portions of their time. So then I want to jump into tax levy. I provided this at the last workshop as well, but I thought I'd add just a little bit more context here. So this is the estimated tax bill, city portion for Pierce County property. So this excludes the TIF portion. We don't have that prepared yet. Won't have that until next month. Other taxing jurisdictions, and it also excludes property tax credits like first dollar, school, and lottery and gaming. But your total levy for 2025 that's been proposed is $8,271,099. That's for all funds, and I'll provide you the breakdown of that in an upcoming slide. What we have to do, because we reside in 2 counties, not every municipality has to do this, but we do, is we end up having to apportion that levy out to each county, the properties in each county. And there's actually a report the state puts out every year that informs how we do that. So the amount of the levy that gets apportioned to Pierce County is a little over $5.2 million, or 63.28% of the levy. You can see what the assessed value for Pierce County is, and then from there the math is just division. So you take that levy, divide it by the assessed value, you're then left with a mill rate you multiply property values by. Now, because we're assessing at 76% of fair market value, an average house is still being assessed at $250,000. Periodically, you go through revaluations, community-wide revaluations. Under state statute, once you dip below 80% of your assessment ratio, you can stay there for 5 years before you have to bring that back up with a full revaluation. But to try to provide some additional context to that $250,000 number, fair market value would be about $329,000. It's assessed at $250,000. Your bill would be about $1,514 in this case. So that's kind of an average city-only portion Pierce County resident tax bill. And then this is the allocation of that. So that's the percentage of the tax bill. You've got 74% going to the general fund, 11% going to library, 13% to debt service, and 2% to capital. So that provides you the breakdown of that total levy. Showed you this slide at the last workshop, but as a reminder, the fiscal plan sets a cap for net levy growth of 4%. So the gross levy increase in 2025 is 6%. But when you take into account new growth, it's actually a little less than 4%. It's 3.81%. And so from a fiscal plan perspective, with net levy growth being the target that council set, we've provided a budget for your approval that meets that target and slightly exceeds it. So then getting into the 2025 capital improvement plan, it's really just a continuation of projects approved as part of the 2024 through 2028 CIP. We'll obviously be coming back to you this next year for updates to that. And in the meantime, there were some adjustments for things like the fire station project of $10 million. library projects inside the building totaling $4 million for Kinney Corridor implementation, as I mentioned before. That's just the phase one Army Corps of Engineer portion. And then $425,000 each for a fire tender, which is grant dependent, and an electric bucket truck. So that fire tender, we don't anticipate moving forward on unless we were to receive a grant. I believe we did apply for one and we were unsuccessful, so we'll just keep trying at that. So for 2026 then, there is some Man Valley infrastructure. This is, if needed, $4.6 million that would be development dependent. Ongoing phases which extend even beyond 2026 for Kinney Corridor implementation. And this is also timing dependent on when that first $1 million does get spent. We've budgeted for that to be done in 2025. The Army Corps of Engineer federal process is kind of a robust one that we're working through, as best as we can, kind of on their timeline. So if that were to kind of spill over into 2026, that would obviously push this portion of the project back as well. But that's what's currently budgeted. And then partial funding for Locust Street extension and electric underground extension at Highway 35 at $300,000. Planned borrowing for the next couple years. So the first thing I just want to point out is we did not have any borrowings this year, obviously. So it was a zero borrowing year. We do plan on coming back this next year, however, and borrowing about $7 million for fire station. The street sweeper, which is in the capital improvement plan, would be about $260,000 is what's been budgeted. And then there is a portion of the Locust Street extension, which would be borrowing as well. That project, however, does include developer financing and some participation from the utilities. So the specific amount there's of the three there, that last one's probably the most subject to some change as we better understand what that project would specifically require. So then what's not included in the biennial budget? We don't have public works facility improvements in here. That I think it was a couple of years ago at this point, Scott had given you a presentation kind of laying out all of the facilities we've got out there that eventually will have some improvement projects as part of them. And public works was one of those. They're all kind of in line, if you will. And so now that we're doing fire station, now that we're looking at library, things will kind of move up the list. And this one would be another that's out there that's not included in this biennial budget. As I mentioned earlier, there is a fire tender that's in the capital improvement plan, not included in the biennial budget unless we receive that grant that I mentioned. New recreation facilities, and there are some department staffing requests that we did not accommodate as part of this biennial budget. The fiscal resources, keeping in mind council net levy targets and things of that nature, we just frankly couldn't get there. So then process and next steps. So your first reading would be this evening. At the next council meeting in November would be the second reading and adoption, public hearing, to approve the 2025 portion of the biennial budget, which is $62,199,106. Just as general reminders, I think I share this every time, but you're approving by functional area and fund. You're providing authority to staff to implement the plan. And then again, you're just appropriating that first year of the biennial budget. You would also be approving a levy collected in 2025 based on your 1/1/2024 assessments. In Wisconsin, we collect in arrears. And so that total levy is $8,271,099, which is a gross increase of 6.1% from 24. But when you factor in growth, as I mentioned earlier, we're at 3.81%, which is underneath that 4% net levy growth target. So you can be authorizing the levy in that amount and authorizing the levy on taxable properties. So I'm going to pause. We're going to talk sewer rates here shortly, but I did want to go ahead and pause here. That was my prepared remarks for the budget. So we'd entertain any questions or comments at this point, if you have any.
I have a quick question. It's probably a real simple answer, but why in the Locust Street extension would the utilities be responsible for part of that upgrade?
So generally speaking, with transportation projects, anytime you're touching your water, your sewer, your electric, anything like that, we budget just, again, as a matter of conservative budgeting, we budget for the utilities share of those projects. And then if it turns out through a combination of, there's been a couple of examples where we get into the project design a bit more. Maybe there's less utility required than we originally thought. Developer contributions are more than we thought, things like that. It doesn't end up happening. But kind of as a general rule of thumb, whenever we've got transportation projects, we try to set aside some amount of money for utility participation until we better understand those.
But that extension is for a developer's need, or I guess I don't understand why the city's going through that expense and requiring our utility department to be part owner of it.
Yeah, so it would be one of the new primary access for wastewater treatment plant. It would also continue to serve the yard waste site. And then I don't remember if we have a water extension. Is there a looping there, Todd? So it's also a water looping. You're looping water from Apollo down to Winter. And we have developer contributions towards a portion of that project.
A portion.
Yep.
I have a question. I had requested that our city's electric utility consider adopting the utility box art program that Steve Preisler used to run. Steve passed away, and well back here. And part of what I was looking at developing was a program that the city could run responsibly that wouldn't come out of the maintenance budget, but come out of the utility because it's more appropriate that way. And it could have a measured approach up to potentially 5 a year, but usually it's just 1 to 2. And from my understanding, they reviewed it and they said yes, but I'd really like to get some details. I know I wanted to see city themes included. City themes include Bird City, Tree City, our community status, and other different aspects of our community that the community enjoys being on some of those mailboxes. So I'd kind of like to know what that process would look like if it's possible. And where we're at with it. Is it included in our budget?
We don't have a specific line item for those boxes, but as you mentioned, we've over time done maybe 1 or 2 in an annual period. I don't know that we've done any in the last couple of years. But we're looking at a new wrap product too that would allow us to do kind of an art contest, and then you get it kind of I don't know if it's vinyl or what the material is, but allow us to expand the number of artists. You don't have to be a painter then to do that. And so there's not a specific line item though in the budget. So if the council wanted a specific project proposal, we could do that. Our plan was just to work through the utilities budget to do a couple, I guess is the best way to say that. So if you need more detail, that's not provided to you anywhere in these documents. So that'd be up to the council how much you wanted to determine that, or if you want to send it back to the utility, or if you want me to prepare something for another meeting.
On average, it's 1 to 2 a year. When there's like a year or 2 or 3 miss, it can go up to 5 because it all kind of tends to get done at once. When you're in the art review committee, you kind of see these things. So it's probably the same type of discussion that I imagine you and Kevin would have. So.
Sure. So I would just say, do you want to use a mic?
Sean, every year WPPI Energy commits dollars to each of its 51 member communities. It's called Commitment to Community. Currently, we receive about $30,000 for that. I see in WPPI's budget, our amount will go up to near $50,000. So in the past, when we painted these, we've taken the small amount of funding needed out of that Commitment to Community from WPPI. So we'll have dollars available in there again to do that through the Commitment to Community from WPPI budget.
Perfect. Thank you so much for explaining that. Thank you very much for explaining that. I appreciate that, Kevin.
Hey, I have a quick question on the ash trees. I know we've got money budgeted the next 2 years here. Did we think that was going to be the end of it then? Are we able to finish?
No, that won't finish the ash trees. Okay. So I think that should get us at least half of what's remaining.
Okay. Wow.
And we'll get you an update. I don't know what the latest inventory is, but we can give you an update before the next reading of the budget to just say, here's what we think the inventory of standing ash is, and then we can take our best guess at, say, $400 a tree or $500 a tree, what it's gonna take to get us through that. But no, this will be a 27, 28 issue also.
Okay, we will move into sewer rates then. I mentioned this at the last workshop that in addition to electric and water rates, we were also looking at sewer. This is not regulated by the Wisconsin Public Service Commission. So the updates to these rates can be adopted by the city council via resolution. But our approach to looking at these rates and coming up with recommended adjustments looks exactly like it does for electric and water. We just don't have the additional layer of the Public Service Commission requirements. So we did a look at cost recovery. So this is a cost of service study. I know it's a little bit small, so I'll try to walk through it here. So currently, for each customer category, what you do with the cost of service studies, you essentially just look at what does it cost to serve that category, and then you look at what we're currently recovering by category, and you end up with a percent of cost recovery. So for residential customers, we're currently recovering about 96%, no, almost 97% of the cost to serve them. For multifamily, it's 85%, commercial is 87%, industrial is 86%, public authority is 83%. With the recommended rates that I'll just be getting into on the next slide, overall we'll be right at about 100% cost recovery. And by category, that would be 99.8% recovery for residential customers, 99.1% for multifamily, 103.1% for commercial, 92% for industrial, and 102% for public authority. So when you work through the rates and you're adjusting them and you're trying different scenarios out, it does get pretty difficult to dial it right in at 100% for all of them. There's just so many variables. But generally, the goal is to get right around 100%, as close to it as you can for each of them, with obviously the bottom line goal of being 100% cost recovery. So then what we're looking at doing for this particular utility, which is not an option that's available to us for electric and water, is we're actually looking at leaving the volumetric portion alone completely. So that's the bottom half of this chart here. You can see domestic sewage, septic and holding tanks, high strength surcharge rates. That would be a 0% increase. We're just going to leave those alone. And where you see the changes then is to the flat or customer fixed portion of the charge. Frankly, we would want to do more of this with our electric and water utilities if we could, and the PSC lets us do it to an extent, but they don't let us go quite as far with it as we would like, as we would propose. But with this being a utility not regulated by the Public Service Commission, we are proposing this, only changing the flat portion. So, as a utility, what you don't then become inadvertently impacted by is the fluctuations in usage, because you're just recovering more through that fixed portion. And with our utilities, so much of the cost of those utilities that we're trying to cover are fixed costs. It's the utilities that are in the ground. For electric, it's above ground. And so when you subject more of your cost recovery and you put more of the burden on it on the volumetric portion, which ebbs and flows, you may inadvertently put your utility at some amount of financial risk then. So by switching more to the fixed portion, you mitigate that to some degree. So if I go back a slide, you'd see that we're moving cost recovery for the utility from almost 68% volumetric and 32% fixed to 63% volumetric and 37% fixed. We're moving more toward having more of the revenue come from fixed, but even with this changes that have been proposed, we're only moving that dial about 5%. So, and what that means then, just a sample of a variety of customer types and meter sizes then, is for your average residential customer, that's going to be a $1.10 per month increase, or about 2.83%. Now that particular adjustment affects 99.6% of our residential customers. Not all of them are on the 3/4 meter, but for 99.6% of them, it would be a $1.10 per month increase. And you can see then by category what that looks like. So for your industrial customers, it's actually, even though for the 1-inch meter and 2-inch meter customers, it's increasing by $45 per month or 87, it's still a fairly small percentage change, and that's because so much of their cost and their usage is tied to the volumetric portion. And there are only a few of those customers. So if you go back to the slide where I talk about percent of cost recovery, we're moving from 86% cost recovery for industrial customers to 92%. So we're not able to get as high with them just because there aren't that many of them, and they have meter types that a lot of other customer categories do as well. So you end up kind of playing a game of you're adjusting certain meter types, and then you're looking at the effect to the customer category, and you're not trying to be overly punitive on cost recovery to other customer categories that may share the same meter size with those industrial customers. So in working with our consultant that also helped us with the water rates, this is where we've landed for a recommended rate structure. And so then what it means for average residential bills, since that's kind of what we like to use as our basis of projection and comparison and such, is we don't really move up in terms of the list of comparables. We certainly, our average cost for residential customers does go up by about, is that $13.20 per year, but that doesn't actually put us past any of the other comparable sewer utilities. So what that means for wastewater utility estimated cash flows then. So the bottom is our net income or loss. You can see our operating revenues, non-operating revenues at the top, your operating and maintenance expenses, debt service transfers, and then in 2023, we incurred some issuance expenses in connection with that borrowing. You can see that by 2024, now this may end up being a little bit conservative. We like to budget and estimate conservatively, so revenues may come in slightly higher, expenses may come in slightly lower, but we're currently projecting about a $338,000 annual deficit for this fund. Could be a little better by the time we get to the end of the year, but regardless, the trend is really what I would like to point out here. So when you look at 2021 net income and you just trend that to 2024 projected, it's a pretty compelling story of a decline in our net income, and a lot of that's due to inflation. A lot of that's some additional borrowing costs. We are going to be spending less to have our own biosolids facility than we would if we had stayed in the Ellsworth consortium, but nevertheless, our costs are still going up for that, just not as much as they would have been if we'd stayed in the Ellsworth consortium. And you see that bear out in this data here. So with the rates going into effect for 2025, you do then start to see some improvement there to that bottom line, and we would expect that to continue to grow over time. And if you recall, going back to almost 3 years now when Trilogy came and presented their findings for moving away from the consortium, that would play a role in this moving forward as well, that we should see continued improvements in the bottom line for this fund once the new rates go into effect, once we continue to reap the benefits of leaving the consortium. One thing to consider, which we had talked about a couple months ago, I think at this point with our utility rates, is because of the ease of being able to approve new rates for this fund compared to the others, this may be one that we would like to try to revisit a little bit more regularly than the other ones. That's not built into what you see here. This is only based on this one-time adjustment we're recommending, but something to consider for future years is perhaps more regular, more inflationary-based adjustments for this particular fund. And so that's actually all I have for sewer rates. We'll pause and talk about that, but I do just want to point out the biennial budget can be found on the city's website. We'll have a copy at City Hall and the River Falls Public Library. First reading of the budget ordinance is this evening. second reading would be November 12th, and we would also like to include the fee schedule for you at that time as well. And then, of course, Scott and I are available for questions at any time. So I will backtrack to sewer and entertain questions or comments.
Josh, I got a question. So with the PSC regulated funds, they make us build in a rate of return. From what I can understand, what you showed us, we're just hoping to break even,
So with
just
the,
hoping to collect 100%. Is there, not that I want to increase it anymore, but over time, would we want to start to consider a 2 to 3% rate of return? So we've got some cushion for that fluctuation and, go ahead.
no, that's actually the kind of thing that I, sit in my office and nerd out about is do we want to try to do more of a similar to the PSC for those regulated utilities at rate of return? I would say what we aim for right now, and I should have mentioned it, is for this utility, because it's not regulated, rate of return from the PSC's perspective doesn't apply. What we're really looking for here is the debt coverage council metric and the 90 days working capital council metric. So this particular fund, part of the story for how we, budgeted that biosolids facility borrowing the way we did, and like I mentioned, it's a fairly flat net result when the 2005 borrowing comes off. We did that also keeping in mind that debt coverage measure. So we're getting a little low there for that particular fund. Working capital is also, you can kind of see the net income effect there. So that's been historically healthy for this fund, but it is trending down. So to answer your question briefly, I guess, is it's more about the working capital and the debt coverage metrics for this fund. We could certainly look to do more of a rate of return measure in the future, though.
Okay.
And this is cash flow. So this isn't gonna result in the rate of return calculations. You would look at depreciation and some of those other things. And so we do, we can measure a rate of return similar to those other, but I guess I want to point out, this is just showing cash flow. So
Okay.
yes, from a cash flow perspective, it's like, why aren't we making money or whatever, but you're covering all the debt, all the coverage. And we have a good fund balance too. And as you can see, the O&M expenses are going to go down, pretty considerably. So we also have the comfort that this is a locally regulated utility.
Right.
So we have the ability to react quicker than we do with the PSC regulated things. And that's the PSC has kind of built all that, what I would consider extra profit in, because they know you're not going to come around for another 5 years or something. But the direction we had from council, which you should take credit for, is you've told us before, try to do some more regular increases so that the impacts are less. But you've also said, use your ratios to benchmark what you're bringing in, because we're not looking to get a whole bunch of cash piled up. We're not looking to do that. And so we probably could have done the wastewater utility last year, but we looked at our ratios and thought, we can get another year through here, and that's just helpful to the ratepayers. Of course, the other argument there, which you've all made, again, we're aware of your concern about big increases, is we could have done a little bit last year and a little bit this year to change these numbers, but I'm pretty comfortable with that. I think that what we wanted to understand, if there's any feedback, is this going to more fixed base, because it's just the operations of the wastewater utility are heavily influenced by the fixed plant costs. It does matter how much sewer we treat, right? The pumps run more, there's electricity costs and other things, but essentially you've sized your plant based on what your capacity, and then everybody's kind of paying for that capacity to be able to flush whenever they want and send us whatever. So I would see, along the lines of what you've asked us to do of more regular increases, that we probably would focus on the fixed side of things for the next few years for wastewater. PSC has not been that helpful with electric and water. That's my editorial comment. Whereas with wastewater, we can, you could add 50 cents a month every year to the fixed cost, and you'll know exactly what kind of revenue you generate. You'll know exactly what the impact is to the customer. And I think at 37% or 38% fixed, we have not done a study that I can say to you 79% of our costs are fixed and 31%, 21% is variable, but we know it's way more than 37.3% fixed. Like, you can look at your assets and know that you're not even close. So as we get closer to that, as we creep the fixed customer charge up, and we're being transparent about what our plan is, right? We're telling you as staff and the community, the plan would be to focus on that fixed side because it seems out of whack with the actual costs of running this utility. We're a long ways from having a real heavy policy debate of have we reached the point where we're charging too much fixed? We're not, in my opinion, and I think you could show that. And then there's not a lot of communities, but there's some communities really looking at an all fixed base charge on the sewer, especially in certain categories. So they might say a 3/4 inch residential, you're just gonna pay $40 a month. And every month you pay $40, doesn't matter
How much volume?
how much water you use or flush, that's what you're gonna get. That seems a little radical for us to just switch on our customers, and that's not the end game. So the end game isn't to eliminate the volumetric charges. The end game is just to start to watch that 62, 37%, and start to benchmark that a little bit better. Because essentially, as a resident in this town, which well over 90% of our customers are that 3/4 inch. Well, I shouldn't say that. Well, 90, not by revenue, but by customer count. Most of your customers are that 3/4 inch residential. They're basically getting the benefit of being connected to your system, right? The volume is not a big benefit to any house, right? Whether you can have 7 toilets or 1, it's just the ability that you never worry about it. We take care of it. So that's what our plan is. We're gonna work that a little bit on the water and electric because you have some of the same forces in water and electric, but it's just a lot more complicated to work through the process with water and electric because the PSC doesn't appear to be convinced yet that we should go away from volumetric, and they primarily want to do it on a conservation basis. But that's not really the case for sewer because people aren't going to conserve their water use to save on their sewer necessarily. They're going to get that charge mostly on the water bill if they use more water.
Kevin, on the sewer, I'm sure probably number one is labor is your largest cost, and then probably the facility. But what are the major costs in sewer? Is it the running the electrical pumps, or what's in this time when you talk? Turn on your speaker. Your mic was off.
So today, one of the largest
Is it on
costs,
now?
it's on now.
And that's page 133 of the budget book.
So I think today, one of the largest costs must be the West Central biosolids, probably creeping up near $700,000 a year. So that cost will be going away. That'll be replaced with debt service cost and energy cost to dry our product, which we hope is a little bit less than the 700,000.
So yeah, energy costs for the
dryer.
Dryer and
Mhm.
okay.
Your personnel costs are over the biennium. Remember, these are 2 years.
Yep.
2.7 for personnel, and then your operating's 1.6. And then biosolids is the 700 that Kevin mentioned. We've got some transfers, and then debt services is well over 1.2.
Mhm.
Yep. And Josh mentioned some of those debt services are coming off the books too and expiring. So that's also good news for us.
So yes, the people, making sure we have 24/7, 365 coverage for operators is still your big expense. Not to mention the infrastructure required
Right.
to bill and monitor and collect and pay bills and all the other stuff that's involved. So
else have any other questions on the sewer? I remember, Kevin, we had talked about this years ago. It might have been the last time we talked about rates on going more towards not the volumetric, but the covered.
The fixed cost, yeah.
Infrastructure cost.
Yep, and I think Josh and Scott both brushed on that. You know, I'm kind of a fan of it, but it is a dramatic change for our customers where you would go with a hard fixed cost for everybody and not have any volumetric cost for sewer. But that is quite a jump from where we're at now. We continue to talk about it and consider it. And as you move forward, maybe we'll discover you have more of an appetite for that. But that is a direction I think we're talking about going where it'd be more of a fixed cost than a volumetric cost for sewer. I think that's where we're kind of headed.
I remember the discussion we had had, I think we had had it during the council meeting, was
That does interest me.
for all the utilities,
But the
infrastructure
impacts are
costs.
great to a lot of the customer base, so we're careful.
Hey, Josh,
That's the end of my presentation.
anybody got anything? Good. I guess that's it.
Ending early, 2 for
Josh,
2.
thank you and staff for doing a fantastic job on the budget.